Once upon a time, there lived a young man named David Oluwaseun. David was a man who seemed to have it all: wealth, lineage, and a sharp mind, which he inherited from his parents, Chief Edward and Madam Grace. But in the eyes of the world, he was merely an extension of their legacy, a figurehead rather than a man of his own making. On this evening, David stepped into the expansive gallery hall, his polished Oxford shoes clicking softly against the marble floors. The room was a sea of flowing agbadas, bespoke suits, and glittering gowns, the scent of expensive cologne mingling with notes of jasmine and amber. This was his world: high society events, charitable galas, and business mixers in the heart of Lagos. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging polite smiles and handshakes with acquaintances. Yet, beneath his poised exterior, the familiar ache remained. His father, Chief Edward Oluwaseun, was a financial magnate who had built a vast empire from scratch, and his mother, Madam Grace, was an influential art collector. David had inherited their sharp mind and keen eye for detail, but he had also inherited the burden of their name. Every success he achieved in his career as an investment strategist was dismissed by skeptics as nepotism, and every failure scrutinized as a potential embarrassment to his family. As he reached for a glass of champagne from a passing server, his attention was caught by a woman standing across the room. She was elegant, with sharp features and a confident air that seemed out of place in the sea of forced politeness. Her gaze met his, and she smiled, a genuine crooked smile that made his pulse quicken. She didn't seem like the type to belong here, but that only intrigued him more. "David Oluwaseun," she said smoothly as she approached, offering her hand. Her voice had a warm, confident tone that carried a hint of mischief. "You're a hard man to miss in a crowd." He tilted his head, intrigued. "And you are?" Sarah Okafor. "Just a humble architect trying to blend in at a fancy gala," she replied with a wink. David chuckled, feeling the tension of the evening ease slightly. Her casual demeanor was refreshing. They spent the rest of the evening talking, finding common ground in their shared love of modern art and cityscapes. Sarah spoke passionately about her work designing community spaces and revitalizing urban neighborhoods, and David found himself captivated by her vision. Over the next few weeks, Sarah became a fixture in his life. She wasn't intimidated by his success or his family's wealth, at least that's how it seemed. She made him laugh, listened to his frustrations about work, and treated him like a person, not a brand. It wasn't long before David found himself falling for her, despite the cautious warnings from his friends and family. His best friend Michael had been the most vocal. "Dave, she's charming, sure, but something feels off. She seems too eager, like she's trying to prove something." David dismissed his concerns. "Not everyone is out to get me, Mike. Maybe she just likes me for me." His parents were more subtle, but no less skeptical. During a dinner at their estate in Ikoyi, his father had asked Sarah pointed questions about her career and background, his tone polite but probing. Sarah answered with ease, but David noticed the tightness in her jaw afterward. "I'm not here to impress your dad," she'd said later, brushing it off with a laugh. "I'm here for you." Despite the doubts whispered in his ear, David was smitten. He proposed less than a year after they met. Even though his family and friends advised him to take his time, he felt sure she was the one, and she accepted without hesitation. The wedding was a grand affair held in the sprawling gardens of his family's estate. David spared no expense, ensuring every detail was perfect. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed more focused on the guest list, insisting on inviting influential figures she claimed could help her expand her business. On the surface, everything seemed idyllic, but there were cracks in the foundation that David chose to ignore. During the wedding planning, Sarah had clashed with him over everything from the choice of menu to the seating arrangements, accusing him of being controlling whenever he disagreed with her suggestions. It was his mother who first voiced what David had been trying to suppress. "David, my son," Madam Grace said as they stood in the groom's suite on the morning of the wedding. "Are you sure about this? You don't have to go through with it if you're having second thoughts." David shook his head, brushing off his mother's concern. "Mom, it's just nerves. Sarah's a good woman. She loves me." His mother sighed but said nothing more. her expression unreadable. The ceremony was beautiful, and for a brief moment David allowed himself to believe in the fairy tale. As he stood next to Sarah, exchanging vows under a canopy of white roses, he pushed aside the nagging doubts. This was his chance at happiness, a partnership built on love and mutual respect. Or so he thought. As the reception wound down and guests began to depart, David noticed Sarah talking animatedly with a group of investors he didn't recognize. He overheard snippets of their conversation, enough to realize she was networking, using the wedding as an opportunity to pitch her projects. His chest tightened with unease, but he told himself it didn't matter. It was her way of contributing, of proving she belonged in his world. That night, as they left for their honeymoon, Sarah held his hand tightly, whispering promises of a future filled with love and adventure. David wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe he had made the right choice. But as the plane took off, leaving behind the world he knew, a small voice in the back of his mind asked if he was flying toward happiness or disaster. David silenced the voice, determined to make his marriage work. After all, he thought, love was about compromise. Little did he know just how much he would be asked to compromise and how much it would cost him. The honeymoon began in Paris, a city that had always held a special place in David's heart. Walking hand in hand along the Seine, exploring the hidden corners of Montmartre, and indulging in decadent French cuisine, it all felt like a dream. Sarah was attentive, affectionate, and endlessly charming. She made him laugh with her attempts to speak French, and listened intently as he shared childhood memories of visiting the city with his parents. For a brief moment, David believed the fairy tale. He convinced himself that his doubts were nothing more than pre-wedding jitters amplified by the opinions of those around him. Sarah loved him, and he was determined to make their marriage work. But the cracks began to show even before their bags were unpacked. On their second night in Paris, David chose a bespoke navy suit and a pair of loafers his mother had gifted him. He felt elegant, confident. When Sarah saw him, her lips curved into a smile, but her words carried a subtle sting. "You look handsome," she said, her eyes scanning him up and down. "But don't you think that suit is a little much? It might draw the wrong kind of attention." David frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, her tone light. "Nothing, babe. You look amazing. I just don't want people to think you're trying too hard." It was a small comment, seemingly insignificant, but it stayed with him throughout the evening. He found himself second-guessing his outfit, wondering if he had indeed overdone it. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed completely at ease, joking with the waitstaff and ordering for him without asking what he wanted. By the end of the honeymoon, David began noticing a pattern. Sarah would make casual remarks about his choices, his clothes, his grooming, even the way he spoke to strangers. "You're too nice," she said one afternoon when he struck up a conversation with a shopkeeper. "Not everyone deserves your time." At first, he brushed it off as her way of protecting him, but the frequency of her comments grew. They weren't overtly cruel, but they carried an undercurrent of criticism that made him feel as though he were constantly falling short. When they returned home to Lagos, real life crept in. David threw himself back into his work, excited to dive into a new project that had the potential to reshape his firm's approach to sustainable investing. He shared his ideas with Sarah over dinner, expecting her to be proud of his ambition. Instead, she dismissed his enthusiasm with a flippant comment. "Sounds complicated," she said, barely looking up from her phone. "Don't you ever get tired of all that stress? I mean, you don't have to work, you know? We're doing fine." The words stung. David loved his career. It was a part of who he was. He tried to explain this to Sarah, but she waved him off, changing the subject to something trivial. It was the first time he felt a gulf between them, a distance he couldn't quite bridge. Over the next few months, Sarah's true nature began to reveal itself. She started taking control of their finances, insisting that it was her responsibility as the wife to manage the household budget. At first, David didn't mind. He trusted her. But he began to notice small things, unauthorized withdrawals from their joint account, expensive purchases she hadn't mentioned. When he confronted her about it, she laughed. Relax, Dave. I'm just making some investments. You'll thank me when they pay off. He wanted to believe her, but unease settled in his stomach. The purchases didn't stop, and her explanations became vaguer. It's business, she said whenever he pressed for details. You wouldn't understand. Sarah also began to distance him from his family and friends. She made excuses to skip dinners with his parents, claiming she felt unwelcome. They've never liked me, she said, planting seeds of doubt in his mind. They think I'm not good enough for you. David defended her at first, but deep down he knew his parents' reservations weren't baseless. His father had always been polite but wary, and his mother's eyes would tighten whenever Sarah spoke about money. Still, David found himself drifting further from them, unwilling to face the discomfort their interactions brought. His friendships suffered as well. Michael, his best friend, was the first to notice. Dave, you've been distant lately, Michael said one afternoon over drinks. Is everything okay with Sarah? David hesitated, then forced a smile. Everything's fine. She's just been busy with work, and so have I. Michael didn't look convinced. Dave, you know I'm here if you need to talk about anything. David nodded, but he didn't take Michael up on his offer. He told himself he didn't want to burden his friend, but the truth was more complicated. He didn't want to admit that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. At home, Sarah's behavior grew more controlling. She began criticizing the way he dressed, the people he spent time with, and even the way he spoke in meetings. You're too direct, she said, after he recounted a tense client negotiation. People don't like that. It makes you seem aggressive. The word hit him like a slap. Aggressive. It was a label he had fought against his entire life, a stereotype often used to diminish successful men who knew what they wanted, or conversely used to paint them as dangerous. He tried to brush it off, but it stayed with him, gnawing at his confidence. As the weeks turned into months, David began to feel like a stranger in his own life. He still excelled at work, but his victories felt hollow. At home, he walked on eggshells, afraid of saying or doing something that would trigger Sarah's criticism. His once vibrant social life had dwindled to occasional text exchanges and rare meetups, always cut short by Sarah's disapproval. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday morning. David was sorting through their mail when he found a statement from an account he didn't recognize. The balance was alarmingly low, and the withdrawals were frequent. Sarah had been funneling money from their joint account into this one without his knowledge. His heart raced as he confronted her, holding the statement in his trembling hands. Sarah didn't deny it. Instead, she turned the blame on him. I'm doing this for us, she said, her voice rising. You're too naive to understand how the real world works. I'm protecting our future. David felt something inside him snap. For too long, he had let her dictate the terms of their relationship, chipping away at his autonomy and confidence. He realized in that moment that the woman he had fallen in love with no longer existed, if she had ever existed at all. But leaving wouldn't be easy. Sarah had entangled herself in every aspect of his life, and he knew she wouldn't let go without a fight. Still, a seed of resolve had been planted. He didn't know how or when, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't live like this anymore. David sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the financial reports in front of him, but the numbers blurred into meaningless patterns. His mind was elsewhere, on Sarah, on their last argument, on the growing weight of unease that had settled over his life. He had always prided himself on his ability to focus, to compartmentalize personal and professional issues. But lately, the walls he had built around his mind were crumbling. At home, Sarah's behavior had become increasingly oppressive. What had once been small, dismissive comments had grown into blatant criticisms. She no longer pretended to be interested in his career, dismissing his successes as luck. Every conversation seemed to circle back to her dissatisfaction with his priorities. You're married now, she had said just last night, her voice sharp. Your focus should be on us, not your job. He had tried to explain that his work was a part of his identity, something that gave him purpose, but Sarah waved him off as if his words were irrelevant. It was becoming a pattern. His thoughts, his feelings, his needs, they no longer seemed to matter. One evening, As they sat down for dinner, Sarah brought up the subject of their finances. She had always insisted on handling the household budget, claiming it was her duty as the wife to manage their home. David had initially agreed, seeing no harm in it. He was busy with his career and trusted Sarah to act in their mutual best interest. But over time, he began to notice discrepancies. Sarah started making large purchases without consulting him. Expensive jewelry, designer bags, even a luxury car he hadn't known about until it appeared in their driveway. When he questioned her, she brushed him off with vague explanations. David's unease grew as he discovered more inconsistencies. Bank statements showed significant withdrawals he couldn't account for, and his personal savings seemed to be dwindling. One day, while going through their mail, he found a credit card statement in Sarah's name with a balance that made his stomach drop. She had maxed out the card on lavish expenses, dinners, gifts, trips he hadn't been part of. When he confronted her, Sarah's reaction was swift and cruel. She accused him of not trusting her, of undermining her role as his wife. Her voice rose, and her words cut deep, each one a calculated blow to his self-esteem. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" she spat. "You wouldn't even have this life if it weren't for your parents' money. You don't know the first thing about real work." David was stunned into silence. He had always known Sarah could be sharp-tongued, but this was different. This was venomous. He wanted to fight back, to remind her of his achievements and hard work, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, a part of him had started to believe her. The isolation followed soon after. She discouraged him from attending social events, saying they were a waste of time. When he did manage to see his friends, she would sulk or call him repeatedly, demanding to know when he would be home. At work, David's performance began to suffer. He missed deadlines, forgot important meetings, and found himself unable to concentrate. His colleagues noticed, but he deflected their concern, blaming his struggles on the demands of his personal life. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of Sarah's control and his own silence. The turning point came one afternoon when David returned home early from work. He found Sarah in her home office, hunched over her computer. She didn't hear him come in, too absorbed in whatever she was doing. As he approached, he saw the screen. An email exchange between Sarah and a luxury travel agency arranging a trip to the Maldives. His name wasn't mentioned anywhere. "Who's the trip for?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Sarah jumped, slamming her laptop shut. Her expression shifted quickly from surprise to anger. "Why are you snooping around?" she demanded. "You have no right to invade my privacy." David stood his ground. "I have every right to know how you're spending our money." "Our money?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Don't kid yourself, Dave. I've been the one managing everything while you play at being a career man." The words cut deeper than he expected. For years, David had fought against the stereotype that children of the wealthy were lazy or incompetent. Hearing Sarah dismiss his accomplishments so easily was a blow to everything he had worked for. The confrontation escalated, with Sarah accusing him of being ungrateful and disrespectful. She stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. David stood in the empty hallway, his hands trembling, his mind racing. In that moment, he realized how much of himself he had lost. He had allowed Sarah to chip away at his confidence, to isolate him from the people who loved him, to control every aspect of his life. And for what? To keep the peace? To prove to himself and others that his marriage was worth saving? That night, David lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. He thought about the man he used to be, strong, independent, unafraid to take risks. He thought about his parents, who had always taught him to value himself and never settle for less. He thought about Michael, who had seen through his facade even when David refused to. By morning, a seed of resolve had been planted. He didn't know how or when, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't live like this anymore. Something had to change, and this time, he would be the one to take control. David smoothed the fabric of his dark blue bespoke suit, taking one last look in the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, poised but uneasy. The suit was stunning, a gift from his mother on his last birthday.
but tonight it felt like armor. He was determined to make this evening a turning point, a chance to either salvage what remained of his marriage or confront the truth he had been avoiding for far too long. He had chosen one of Lagos's most exclusive restaurants for the occasion.
It was the type of place that required reservations months in advance, with its dim lighting, impeccable service, and a menu that could rival the art hanging on the walls. David hoped that the elegant setting might soften Sarah, encouraging her to drop the hostility and let them have an honest conversation. When Sarah arrived, she was impeccably dressed in a designer dress that David didn't recognize, likely one of her recent purchases. She kissed his cheek, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. David couldn't help but notice how her gaze lingered on his suit, followed by a faint smirk. "You look expensive," she said. David forced a smile, ignoring the jab. "Thank you for coming tonight. I thought it would be nice to have a quiet evening together." Sarah nodded, signaling to the waiter without consulting him. "Of course. We've both been so busy. It's good to catch up." As the waiter approached, Sarah ordered an extravagant bottle of wine without glancing at the menu. David hesitated but decided not to comment. He would let her take the lead, at least for now. The conversation started innocently enough. Sarah recounted her recent meetings with potential investors, peppering her anecdotes with subtle boasts about her connections. David listened politely, but his mind wandered. Her tone, the way she spoke about her accomplishments, it all felt rehearsed, like she was performing for an audience that wasn't even there. When the first course arrived, Sarah turned her attention to David. "So how's work? Still playing the corporate game?" David set down his fork, feeling his stomach tighten. It's been challenging but rewarding. We've just launched a new initiative focusing on sustainable investments. It's something I've been passionate about for a long time." Sarah shrugged, swirling her wine. "Sounds noble, but don't you ever get tired of it? All that stress, the long hours. I mean, you don't need to work. We're doing fine without it." David took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. "My work isn't just about money, Sarah. It's about purpose. It's important to me." She leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Of course it is. You've always been so driven. But don't you think it's time to focus on other things? You're not getting any younger, Dave." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. David felt his cheeks flush, a mixture of anger and embarrassment rising within him. He searched her face for any sign of remorse, but she looked completely at ease, as though she had just made an innocuous observation. "I didn't realize my career and our future were mutually exclusive," he said evenly, his voice carefully controlled. Sarah waved her hand dismissively. "I'm just saying you don't have to prove anything anymore. Maybe it's time to slow down and enjoy life." David opened his mouth to respond, but the waiter appeared, interrupting with the main course. The timing felt almost deliberate, as if the universe was giving him a moment to collect himself. He glanced down at his plate, the beautifully plated dish almost mocking in its perfection. It was ironic, he thought, how everything around him could appear so polished, while his life felt like it was crumbling. As the meal progressed, Sarah dominated the conversation, recounting her latest networking triumphs and plans for an upcoming business trip. David nodded along, barely listening. His mind was racing, each passing moment solidifying the realization that their relationship was unsalvageable. When the waiter brought the dessert menu, David decided to try something simple but meaningful. He looked across the table and asked Sarah to handle the bill. It wasn't because he thought she couldn't pay, and certainly not to embarrass her. He simply wanted to feel cared for, just this once. David was an established man and had always paid for everything without a single complaint. Even though Sarah never complained about his generosity tonight, he just wanted her to show love in that way for a change. But Sarah interpreted it as an attack. Her eyes went wide, and she exploded. "You are asking me to pay," she shouted, accusing him of trying to disgrace her publicly. "You are pathetic. What kind of man asks a woman to pay his bill? You are a disgrace to men. You are not man enough to even take care of your wife." The restaurant went quiet. Every eye turned to their table. In pure rage, Sarah grabbed the dessert plate in front of her and threw it at David.
The plate shattered, splattering cake across his suit and face. Gasps echoed around the room as diners recoiled in shock. David sat frozen for a moment, the remnants of the tart sliding down his cheek. Then slowly he stood. The humiliation he had felt moments ago was gone, replaced by a calm determination. He reached for his napkin, wiping his face with deliberate precision. "This is over," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Sarah and the shattered remains of their relationship behind. As he stepped into the cool night air, a sense of clarity washed over him. For the first time in years, he felt truly free. It was time to take back control of his life, and he knew exactly where to start. David's shoes echoed against the marble lobby floor of his parents' home, the sound a sharp contrast to the deafening silence in his mind. He clutched his car keys tightly, his suit still stained with the remnants of the chocolate tart Sarah had hurled at him. The humiliation from the restaurant lingered, but beneath it simmered something far stronger. Resolve. The double doors opened before he could reach for the handle. His mother, Madame Grace, stood framed in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning David from head to toe. Madame Grace's face, typically composed and elegant, softened with concern as she took in her son's disheveled state. "David," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What happened?" David didn't respond immediately. He walked past her into the grand foyer, the familiar scent of lavender and polished wood enveloping him. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to relax, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his exhaustion. His father, Chief Edward, appeared at the top of the staircase, his tie loosened and a book in his hand. The sight of David stopped him in his tracks. He descended quickly, his normally stern expression replaced with one of worry. "David," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Are you all right?" David took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he spoke. "No, Dad, I'm not." Madame Grace and Chief Edward exchanged a look before guiding him to the living room. The space was as familiar to David as his own reflection. Plush armchairs, the soft glow of the fireplace, and framed photographs chronicling their family's milestones. It was a room of comfort, of safety, a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind. As David recounted the events of the evening, his parents listened in silence. He spared no detail, from Sarah's growing hostility to the final explosive scene at the restaurant. By the time he finished, his hands were trembling, and anger mixed with relief filled his chest. "I don't know how I let it get this bad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept telling myself things would get better, that I just needed to try harder. But I can't anymore. I'm done." Madame Grace reached across the table, placing a steady hand over David's. "You don't need to do this alone, my son. We're here for you. Whatever you need." Chief Edward nodded from his armchair, his jaw tight with anger. "You've put up with more than anyone should. It's time to take back control of your life." Their words, simple but sincere, felt like a lifeline. For so long, David had believed he had to face his struggles alone, that admitting he needed help was a sign of failure. But here, in the warmth of his family's home, he realized how wrong he had been. The next morning, David woke to the sound of birds outside his childhood bedroom window. The room was exactly as he had left it years ago, down to the neatly organized bookshelves and framed photos of his university graduation. He sat up slowly, the events of the previous night flooding back with painful clarity. But alongside the pain was a newfound sense of purpose. For too long he had allowed Sarah to dictate his life, to undermine his confidence and isolate him from the people who loved him. That ended now. David dressed in simple clothes he found in his old closet and made his way downstairs. His parents were waiting for him in the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. They greeted him with smiles, their warmth bolstering his resolve. Over breakfast, Chief Edward laid out a plan. "I'll connect you with our attorney," he said, his tone decisive. "Barrister Tunde. He's handled cases like this before. We'll make sure Sarah doesn't get away with anything." David nodded, grateful for his support. "I also need to get back to work," he said. "I've been distracted for too long and it's time I refocus." Madame Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. Take it one step at a time, David. You don't have to rebuild everything overnight. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls and paperwork. David reached out to a divorce attorney recommended by his father, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Barrister Tunde. They arranged to meet the following morning to discuss the details of his case. That evening, as David sat with his parents in the living room, a wave of guilt washed over him. He thought about the years he had distanced himself from them, choosing to prioritize a woman who had done nothing but tear him down. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice breaking, "for shutting you out, for not listening when you tried to warn me." Madame Grace moved to sit beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You don't need to apologize, David. You did what you thought was right at the time. What matters is that you're here now." Chief Edward nodded from his armchair. "You've always been strong, Dave.
Stronger than you realize, and now you're taking that strength back." Their words bolstered him, filling him with a sense of determination he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, David allowed himself to hope for a better future, one where he was in control of his own life. The following morning, David arrived at Barrister Tunde's office, a sleek, modern space in the heart of Victoria Island. Tunde greeted him with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. "Let's get started," Tunde said, motioning for David to sit. "Tell me everything." As David recounted his marriage to Sarah, Tunde listened intently, taking detailed notes. When he finished, Tunde leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You have a strong case," Tunde said. "We'll gather evidence of financial exploitation, emotional abuse, and any other misconduct. Sarah might try to fight back, but I assure you, we'll be prepared." David nodded, relief washing over him. For the first time since his marriage began unraveling, he felt like he had an ally, someone who believed in him and was willing to fight for him. Over the next few days, David began taking small but significant steps to reclaim his life. He reconnected with Michael, who welcomed him back with open arms, and began reaching out to colleagues he had distanced himself from. At work, he threw himself into his projects, rediscovering the passion that had once driven him. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Sarah wouldn't let go without a fight, and David knew the coming weeks would be filled with challenges. Yet as he stood in his parents' foyer one evening, watching the city lights of Lagos twinkle in the distance, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was taking control, step by step, piece by piece, and for the first time in a long time, David felt truly alive. David sat at his desk in his office, his fingers drumming on the polished wood surface. The sunlight streaming through the large windows did little to ease the tension knotting his shoulders. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal meetings, reconnecting with old friends, and re-establishing his presence at work. Despite the progress he had made, the specter of his marriage still loomed over him. He knew that Sarah would eventually come for him, and when she did, he had to be ready. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. The caller ID made his stomach tighten. Sarah. He stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to answer. Finally, with a deep breath, he swiped to accept the call. "David." Sarah's voice was sharp, her usual veneer of charm gone. "We need to talk." "There's nothing left to discuss," he replied evenly, though his pulse quickened. "Oh, I think there is," she snapped. "You think you can just walk away from this marriage and take everything with you? You're out of your mind." David's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not taking anything that doesn't belong to me, Sarah. You've exploited me for years and it's over. If you have something to say, you can go through my attorney." "I'm not letting some lawyer dictate my life," she growled. "Meet me tonight. You owe me that much." David hesitated. Every instinct told him to refuse, but a part of him wanted to face her, to confront her head on. "Fine," he said finally. "But we'll meet in public." They agreed on a neutral location, a cafe near the city center. David arrived early, choosing a table near the window where he could see the street outside. His heart pounded as he waited, but he steadied himself, reminding himself of how far he'd come. When Sarah arrived, she looked every bit the polished professional, but her eyes betrayed her anger. She sat across from him, folding her hands on the table as if trying to compose herself. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," she said, her tone deceptively calm. "We're supposed to be a team." "A team?" David echoed, incredulous. "You've spent our entire marriage tearing me down, isolating me and stealing from me. That's not a team, Sarah. That's control." Her jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do to keep us afloat. You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter, David. I had to work for everything I have, and you think that justifies everything you've done." He shot back. "You used me, Sarah. My money, my connections, my reputation, and you still weren't satisfied." Sarah's composure cracked, her voice rising. "You're delusional. I built this life for us while you were busy playing at being some corporate savior. You're nothing without me." David's hands trembled under the table, but he refused to let her see his fear. He met her gaze, his voice steady. "You're wrong, Sarah. I was someone before you, and I'll continue to be someone long after you're gone. You don't define me." Sarah's face darkened, and for a moment he thought she might lash out. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, a bitter smile curling her lips. "You'll regret this, David. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. I'll ruin you." "Do your worst," he said, standing. "I'm done being afraid of you." Without waiting for a response, David turned and walked out of the cafe, his heart racing. He knew Sarah wouldn't back down easily, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. That evening, David sat in Barrister Tunde's office, recounting the confrontation. Tunde listened carefully, his sharp eyes narrowing as David described Sarah's threats. "We need to document this," Tunde said, jotting notes in his leather-bound planner. "Every conversation, every incident. If she tries anything, we'll be ready." David nodded, grateful for Tunde's unwavering support. Over the past few weeks, the attorney had become a lifeline, guiding him through the legal maze with precision and empathy. "Do you think she'll follow through on her threats?" David asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Tunde looked up, his expression serious. "People like Sarah don't handle losing control well. She'll try to intimidate you, maybe even manipulate the narrative to paint herself as the victim. But we have the truth on our side, and we'll use it." David left the office feeling a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't the same man who had endured years of Sarah's abuse. He was stronger now, more resolute, and he wasn't going to let her dictate his life any longer. The next few days were tense. Sarah began a smear campaign, spreading rumors about David to mutual acquaintances. She claimed he had abandoned her, that he was abusive or neglectful. David heard the whispers, saw the raised eyebrows when he walked into meetings or events. It stung, but he refused to let it shake him. Instead, he focused on his work and the people who truly mattered. Michael became a constant presence in his life, offering unwavering support. His parents stood by him, their home a refuge when the stress became overwhelming. One afternoon, David received an email from Tunde. Attached was a file containing evidence of Sarah's financial misconduct, documents showing how she had funneled money from their accounts to fund her own ventures. Tunde had also uncovered correspondence that revealed her manipulation of mutual friends and colleagues. David stared at the file, a mixture of anger and relief washing over him. This was the proof he needed, not just for the divorce proceedings, but for himself. It validated everything he had endured, every moment he had doubted his own perception of reality. As the legal case against Sarah began to take shape, David felt a shift within him. He was no longer a victim, no longer the man who had silently endured years of emotional abuse. He was reclaiming his narrative, his power, his life. The final confrontation with Sarah loomed on the horizon, but David knew he was ready. He had his family, his friends, his legal team, and most importantly, he had himself. For the first time in years, he felt like the man he had always been meant to be. Strong, confident, and unafraid. The courthouse was an imposing building of stone and glass, its towering facade a symbol of justice and finality. David stood at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent the past few weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, recounting years of manipulation, and bracing himself for the inevitable battle. Today marked the start of the final phase, the divorce hearing. His parents flanked him, their presence a steadying force. Madame Grace reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this, David. Stay strong." Chief Edward nodded, his stern expression softening as he met his son's eyes. "This is the end of the road for her. You've already won by taking back your life." David nodded, drawing strength from their words. He took a deep breath and walked through the heavy doors, his shoes clicking against the polished floors. Barrister Tunde was waiting for him inside. "David," Tunde greeted, his tone professional, yet warm. "Are you ready?" "Yes," David replied, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I'm ready." As they entered the courtroom, David spotted Sarah sitting at the defendant's table. She was impeccably dressed as always, but there was a tension in her posture, a flicker of unease in her eyes. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and David saw the same woman who had once swept him off his feet. But that image was quickly replaced by the reality of who she had become, or perhaps who she had always been. The proceedings began with opening statements, each side laying out their case. Tunde spoke with precision and confidence, presenting evidence of Sarah's financial misconduct, emotional abuse, and manipulation. David watched as his lawyer laid out the facts, each piece of evidence cutting through the facade Sarah had worked so hard to maintain. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she painted herself as the victim. She claimed David had neglected their marriage, prioritized his career over their relationship, and abandoned her without warning. Her voice was calm, almost pleading, as she spun her narrative. David felt a wave of anger rise within him, but he remained composed. He knew this was her last attempt to control the story, to paint herself as the aggrieved party, but he also knew the truth was on his side. When it was his turn to testify, David took a deep breath and stepped onto the witness stand. He recounted the years of subtle criticism, the isolation from his friends and family, the financial exploitation, and the final explosive confrontation at the restaurant. His voice remained steady, even as he described the moments that left him feeling small and powerless. "I stayed because I believed things would get better," he said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "I thought if I worked harder, if I gave more of myself, it would save our marriage. But I realized that no amount of effort could change someone who didn't want to change. I deserve better, and today I'm taking the first step toward building the life I deserve." The courtroom was silent as David finished. Even Sarah, who had spent much of the hearing scribbling notes or glaring at Tunde, seemed momentarily disarmed. The judge adjourned the proceedings, announcing that a decision would be rendered the following week. As David left the courtroom, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The outcome was no longer in his hands, but he knew he had done everything he could. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The week passed in a blur. David threw himself into his work, finding solace in the projects he had once loved. He spent evenings with his parents, enjoying simple dinners and rediscovering the warmth of their company. Michael became a regular fixture in his life again, their conversations filled with laughter and the ease of old friendship. When the day of the ruling arrived, David returned to the courthouse with Tunde and his parents by his side. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. David would retain full ownership of his assets, including his family's business interests. Sarah's claims were dismissed, and she was ordered to repay a portion of the funds she had misappropriated. The weight of the decision hit David like a tidal wave. Relief, vindication, and a profound sense of closure flooded him as the judge's words sank in. He had won, not just the legal battle, but his freedom. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone brightly. His parents embraced him, their pride evident in their smiles. "You did it," Madame Grace said, tears glistening in her eyes. "You took your life back." Chief Edward nodded, his hand resting on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning, Dave. You got a whole future ahead of you." David smiled, his chest swelling with hope. For the first time in years, the horizon felt wide open, filled with possibility. In the weeks that followed, David began rebuilding his life, piece by piece. He reconnected with colleagues he had drifted away from, strengthening both his professional network and his personal relationships. At work, he spearheaded a new initiative focused on mentoring young professionals, channeling his experiences into something meaningful. He also launched a foundation aimed at supporting men who had faced domestic and financial abuse, a topic often shrouded in silence in his community. The foundation quickly gained traction, with David sharing his story in interviews and speaking engagements. His vulnerability and resilience resonated with others, inspiring them to find their own strength. Through it all, David never lost sight of the journey that had brought him to this point. The pain, the betrayal, the moments of doubt, they had shaped him, but they did not define him. He was no longer the man who had dimmed his light to let someone else shine. He was stronger, wiser, and unapologetically himself. One evening, as David sat on the balcony of his apartment looking out at the Lagos skyline, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The past was behind him, and the future stretched out before him like an uncharted map. He raised a glass of wine to the night sky, a quiet toast to his journey. He had faced the storm and emerged stronger. Now, it was time to embrace the life he was meant to live. David leaned against the railing of his balcony, the cool evening breeze brushing against his skin. The city stretched out before him, a sea of lights and energy that felt alive with possibility. For years he had felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of his marriage and the expectations placed upon him. Now he stood on the edge of a new chapter, his life finally his own. The foundation he had launched was thriving. Emails poured in daily from men sharing their stories, seeking advice, and expressing gratitude for the resources David's team had made available. Each message was a reminder of why he had chosen this path. His pain, once a source of shame, had become a beacon of hope for others. Tonight he was hosting an event to celebrate the foundation's success. His parents, Michael, and his closest supporters would be there, along with people whose lives had been changed by the programs the foundation offered. David wanted the evening to be more than just a celebration. It was a declaration of his resilience, a moment to honor the strength of every person who had taken back control of their life. The event was held at a stunning rooftop venue in Victoria Island. Guests arrived in elegant attire, the soft hum of conversation blending with the gentle strains of a high-life band. David greeted each attendee with a warm smile, his confidence radiating as he moved through the crowd. He felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found Michael grinning at him, a glass of Chapman in hand. "You've outdone yourself, Dave," Michael said, his eyes scanning the beautifully decorated space. "This is incredible." David laughed, clinking his glass against Michael's. "It's not just me. Everyone here played a part. This foundation wouldn't exist without the support of people like you." Michael's expression softened. "You know, it's amazing to see you like this. Strong, happy, free. I've missed this version of you." David smiled, the words sinking in. For so long he had felt like a shadow of himself, but now he was rediscovering the man he had always been. "I've missed him too," he admitted. The evening unfolded seamlessly. Guests mingled, sharing stories and making connections. David took the stage at one point, his voice steady as he thanked everyone for their support and spoke about the foundation's mission. He shared pieces of his journey, his vulnerability resonating with the room. By the time he finished, the applause was deafening. As the night wound down, David found himself on the rooftop terrace, looking out at the glittering skyline. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see his mother approaching, a soft smile on her lips. "You were wonderful tonight," Madame Grace said, stepping beside him. "Your father and I couldn't be prouder." David felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Mom, for everything. For standing by me even when I didn't make it easy." Madame Grace reached for his hand, her grip firm but gentle. "You've always been strong, David, even when you didn't see it. Watching you take back your life has been one of the greatest joys of mine." David nodded, tears threatening to spill. "I couldn't have done it without you and Dad." I felt so lost for so long, but you never gave up on me." Madame Grace smiled, her eyes shining. "That's what family is for. And now you're building a new family, a community of people who see their strength reflected in yours. That's something to be proud of." David leaned against his mother's shoulder, the two of them gazing out at the city in comfortable silence. The days that followed were filled with activity. David's foundation continued to grow, and his career flourished as he took on new challenges with a renewed sense of purpose. He began traveling, exploring cultures and cuisines he had always dreamed of experiencing. Each trip brought inspiration, new ideas for the foundation, fresh perspectives on life, and a deeper appreciation for his own resilience. In Morocco, he marveled at the vibrant markets. In Japan, he immersed himself in the art of quiet reflection. Every journey was a step toward healing, a celebration of the life he was reclaiming. Back home, David's apartment became a haven of warmth and creativity. His walls were adorned with photos and souvenirs from his travels, each one a reminder of the path he had walked. The man who stared back at him in the mirror each morning was no longer haunted by self-doubt. He was strong, confident, and unapologetically himself. One evening, as David sat at his desk reviewing plans for the Foundation's next initiative, he received an email from Michael. The subject line read, "Look at you." Curious, David clicked it open and found a link to a news article. The headline read, "From Survivor to Leader, David Oluwaseun on Rebuilding a Life of Strength and Purpose." The article detailed David's journey, his work with the Foundation, and his commitment to empowering others. As he read, David felt a swell of pride, not for the recognition, but for the impact he was making. His story was no longer a source of pain, it was a source of hope. That night, David stepped onto his balcony, a glass of wine in hand. The city lights twinkled like 1,000 tiny promises, each one a sign of the endless possibilities ahead. He thought about the man he had been when he first met Sarah, bright-eyed and hopeful, but uncertain of his worth. He thought about the years he had spent dimming his light to let someone else shine, and he thought about the man he was now, strong, independent, and unafraid to take up space in the world. David raised his glass to the skyline, a quiet toast to the journey that had brought him here. "To new beginnings," he whispered, his voice steady and sure. As he sipped his wine, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined him. He was free to live, to love, to dream, and he was just getting started. Thank you for finishing this video. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new stories and inspirational content.